In this clip, we'll create a new plugin using a starter template and implement fetching from the API to create new GraphQL nodes. The fundamental building block of the Gatsby data structure is a node. Nodes can be connected together to form relationships, and they can represent any kind of data you need. Plugins can add new types of nodes through the sourceNodes API in the Gatsby.js file. We'll start by creating our source plugin using the Gatsby new command. The name of a source plugin should begin with Gatsby-source- followed by a descriptive name. We can then pass the starter to be based on, which will be this official starter plugin template. You don't need to watch this, I'll go ahead and skip through the initialization process. I'm going to go ahead and open it now in VS Code. We've already covered the common files you can find in a plugin, so we'll focus on this Gatsby Node.js file. The starter plugin has already added the onPreinit hook to the file, and we'll add an export for the sourceNodes API hook. The first thing we would like to do is fetch the list of glossary terms from our API. In Node.js apps, you'd normally need to craft a request to send, but many people, including myself, prefer to use the node fetch library. I'll open the terminal and execute npm install node fetch, which will add it to our dependencies. Then I can require it in the file to use the fetch API. Now we can make this an async function so that we can await a fetch call to the API endpoint. Once we have a response, we can parse it as JSON by awaiting, but what can we destructure here? Let's take a quick look again at the endpoint in the browser. It looks like there's a top-level glossary property, but there's also another issue. The API requires an API key in the query string. If I remove this, we get an error response back, and we'll need to handle that too. We can destructure the glossary, and I'll rename it to terms to make it clear it's an array of objects. For the API key, we need to pass it as a query string variable in the URL here. Where should it come from? Since we're building a plugin, it's probably best to let the consumer pass in an API key using options instead of hard-coding it into the plugin. Since all Gatsby Node APIs take the plugin options as the second argument to the function, I'll destructure API key from options. Before we forget, it's a good idea to add a plugin options schema to validate that a consumer passes in an API key as a required string. We covered the plugin options schema API earlier in the course. Now what do we do with the glossary terms list? Each term can be thought of as an individual entity or unit, which would correspond to a node in Gatsby. For the sourceNodes API, a helper object is passed to the function, which contains various actions we can call to fire internal Gatsby actions. The action we want here is the createNode action. For each term, we have to call createNode, which accepts some kind of payload object. A node object has a few required properties Gatsby.js expects to find. The first is a node ID. This has to be a unique ID, so we have to use a helper called createNodeID to generate it. We can pass a value that the generator will use to create a type of hash. You should pass some sort of stable identifier from the object you want to make into a node. Usually, it's a good idea to prefix it with a value only your plugin would provide, which will be glossary term. Then, the abbreviation will be unique and stable for each term, so we'll use that. Gatsby helpers are scoped to each plugin, so there wouldn't be a possibility that this would conflict with another type of plugin. The next two properties are parent and children, which will be left null and empty, respectively. These are used to form relationships which we don't need quite yet. You could also just leave them off, and they'll be defaulted to null and empty. Finally, we need an internal property, which is an object containing three other pieces of metadata. Type, which is a string that our plugin provides that lets us categorize a node. We'll use the same glossary term we used for the ID as our type. Content, this has to be a string of the raw value of the node, which will be our term, so we'll use json.stringify. Lastly, content digest, which is a hash of the value of the node. Luckily, we don't have to compute this ourselves. Gatsby provides another helper, createContentDigest, to handle this. We're still missing one critical part of the node, the rest of the information about our glossary term, like the abbreviation, name, and description. We can spread these values on the node itself, which will make the values queryable in GraphQL. We spread it first so that if the object contains a property named the same as a property on the node, like ID, we use the one meant for Gatsby. This means sometimes to preserve properties named the same, you'll want to include them as renamed properties on the node.